On October the 31st, 1517, Martin Luther posted 95 big questions which he believed faced the church of his day to a local church door in Wittenberg, Germany. 500 years later, I decided to post 95 new questions, one a week, to the web, questions which I believe the church must face in the 21st century. God created man in his own image, but unfortunately man has returned the favour, once quipped playwright George Bernard Shaw. His famous comment echoed the work of Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist who suggested that although human beings worship gods, we're the ones who create and shape them to suit our needs in the first place. Durkheim claimed that every society invents a god or a set of gods to reflect its values, its standards, its aspirations, its hopes, its ambitions and its attitudes. Then it worships these gods that it's created, as a way of legitimising and endorsing its own behaviour. For instance, as we know, many ancient civilizations worshipped pagan fertility gods, who, it so happened, rather conveniently demanded that their male followers demonstrate their undying allegiance by hosting orgies, where they were required to have sex with religious or cultic prostitutes. Last week, we looked at the term image of God and saw that, for the ancient Hebrews, it evoked a whole range of ideas which were informed by the wider context of the cultures around them. The idea that a human being could be made in the image of a god was common, and the subject of a number of really well-known pagan creation stories that were circulating around the Near East at the time. These stories all shared common themes, and they all worked extremely well for the powerful and privileged who wrote and peddled them in the first place. At the top of the social pyramid they promoted, as always, sat the king, who was regarded as the only divine image bearer on earth, and who, as a consequence of being in this exalted position, held absolute power and unchallengeable authority. Then, just below him came the priests, whose task it was to endorse and promote his divine rights and privilege. Below them came the bureaucrats, the merchants and the military, whilst at the very bottom of the pyramid came the peasants and slaves who had no rights and no privileges. In this way, through their creation myths and stories, these societies maintained their hierarchical social order. It received religious legitimization, and the poor were oppressed in the name of the local deity. How convenient, and exactly in line with Durkheim's thesis. But as we saw last week, the Genesis counter-myth deliberately subverts this widespread royal ideology. Genesis chapter 1 is the Hebrew people's extremely creative and corrective response to these control systems. It totally undermines the repressive ideas of their hierarchically structured cultures. It declares, so humankind were created in God's image. In the image of God, they were created, male and female. God created them. Instead of the king, the whole of humanity enjoys the privilege and responsibility of bearing the image of God. The divine image is universalized. Humankind, not just the monarch, is appointed to the role of being God's vice-regents on earth. Into a world laden with oppressive hierarchy, the God who is love speaks, and the message of radical equality takes root. This is nothing short of a revolution. And so it is still today, in the 21st century, that the Genesis narrative confronts our divided and inequitable society about the way we treat our fellow human beings, each made in the image of God. All of which means that the church has a very distinctive, indeed vital voice that it should be bringing to the conversation about human rights. Because for the church, the challenge of answering the question, what does it mean to be human, is nothing short of grappling with the biblical concept of what it means that every human being is in the image of God. The problem is that for us, just as for those ancient Hebrews, although we have a different story, the trappings of our surrounding culture can so easily overwhelm us. Our 21st century secularist, power, wealth and status quo driven culture can too easily bewitch us. And as a former Archbishop, William Temple, once pointed out, the more distorted a person's idea of God and the more passionately they're committed to it, the more damage they will do. It was the French biologist Jean Rostand who said, "For my part, I believe there's no life that does not deserve respect and is not worthy of defending with zeal and conviction. I would almost measure society's degree of civilization by the amount of effort and vigilance it imposes on itself out of sheer respect for life." Martin Luther's original 95 questions nailed to that door in Wittenberg were a challenge to the church of his day about the way they were. The church in our day equally faces pressing questions. I put it to you that Durkheim's challenge is one of them. But just before I leave you with a question, it's fascinating that one of the reasons that the famous professor of ancient literature C.S. Lewis gave for his motivation to follow Christ was that the God of the Hebrews defies Durkheim's point. No society, he said, would ever have invented the God of the Bible, the God who loves all indiscriminately, the God of justice and of inclusion for all. So, in the light of all this, what does it really mean in Jesus' radical words to love God and to love others the way you love yourself?